Adding search functionality to our site is actually going to be pretty easy because all we have to do is loop into Craft's existing search functionality using GraphQL to pull in our search results. So the first step in getting that set up is to add some additional parameters to our GraphQL query. So we'll go into our query file, our entries query, and we're going to add two new filter parameters. We're going to add search, which is a string, and order by, which is also a string. And these are exactly the same as the parameters that you would add if you were doing a Craft entries query on a Twig template. All of these parameters can be used in a Twig template, just the same as we're using them here. So now we'll add these filters to our subqueries. So we'll go search, search, and order by. We also want to make sure that we add our search filter to our entry count subquery because we're going to need to know what the total number of search results are for our query. So we'll just go ahead and add search. And we don't need to bother with order by with entry count because it doesn't really matter what the order is, it just matters how many there are total. So now that we've added these new parameters to our query, the next thing we need to do is tweak our caching rules. So when we set up pagination, we added this offset limit pagination function to our cache policy, and that told Apollo to merge all entries together regardless of any unique filter variables like offset or limit. And that worked great when all that we had was one single list of entries. But now that we're adding search into the mix, it's possible for us to have multiple different batches of results that are stored in different caches. And so now we need to tell this offset limit pagination function that it needs to be storing different caches depending on whether or not we're just doing a regular entry listing or a search query listing. So the way that we do that is we're going to pass something called key arguments, or key args as they're known in the Apollo docs. And so we're just going to create a variable called listing key args, and it's going to be an array, and it's going to be all of the individual types of caches that we want to save separately instead of merging together. And so we want one cache for the section filter, and then we want another cache for the search filter. All of this is explained a little bit more in depth in the blog post that goes with this video. So if you want to understand this a little bit more clearly, I would recommend going over there and reading that because it's a bit complicated. So now we're going to take this key arguments array and we're just going to pass it straight into our offset limit pagination function. And we're also going to go ahead and add our entry count subquery as well, because again, we don't want our two different types of filters to be merged together. We don't want search to be smashed on top of section. We want to have two separate entry count results. And so in order to do that, we're not going to pass a function. We're just going to use the key args option in the Apollo settings, and then we'll just pass the same array. Okay, so now that we save this, you can actually see this at work in the Apollo DevTools. So if we open up our DevTools, and if we go to the cache tab of our DevTools, you can see now that our caches are being saved with these keys of section because we told it, pay attention to these keys and save your caches according to those unique keys. So we've got one for section and one for the entry count for section. And then as we add a search query, it will save as a separate cache with a separate keys. So our next step is to get our actual search input set up in React. And for our search query, we want to manage the search query using state. But because this search query directly affects our Apollo query, we actually want to use a special type of state variable that Apollo provides for us called a reactive variable. So we're going to pull in our reactive variable from Apollo. That is initialized using the variable makeVar. And then we also need one more variable to initialize the reactive variable, which is called useReactiveVar. So we're going to import that, useReactiveVar. And so now we need to create our reactive variable, our state variable. So we're going to go const search query, make var, and we set our default value, which for us is going to be undefined. And we want this to be undefined because if we have an empty string, Craft will interpret that as a search value. But if there is an empty string, we want that to be interpreted as no search filter whatsoever so that we don't get any unexpected results. Now you'll notice that we created this reactive variable outside of our component, which is different from a React state variable. The next step is to tell Apollo Apollo that it should be watching this variable for state changes and then refetch the query if it detects a state change. So the way we're going to do that is we're just going to pass it into our query variables object. So we'll go search and then use reactive var. So that tells it, pay attention to this and refetch if there's a change. Now let's create a handler function for our search input on change event. So we'll create a new handle search change, and we need to pull in an event, and we'll create a variable for the input value, which is our event target value. So the value of the input, the search field. And then when the search field is changed, we want to assign a value to our reactive variable. And so to do that, we call the reactive variable as a function. So we go search query, and then we pass in our new value. So it's input value, but we also want to check if the search query is empty. So if the user deleted their search query, we need to check if that's empty. And instead of an empty string, we want to make sure that we're passing in an undefined value so that it nullifies the search variable completely. And now all that's left to do is to pass this handler to our search component. So we'll go down to search filter. We need to pass it the input value, which is our search query reactive variable. So whatever the current state of that search query variable is going to be the value of the search input, and then our handler. So handle change. And then we'll go in and hook these up to the component itself. We've got our two props, input value and handle change. And so now down in our value, we've got input value. And the way that you get the value for an Apollo reactive variable is to call it as an empty function. So we just add some parentheses at the end. And now again, we need to do another null check. So we need to check if the input value has the value of undefined. And if it does, we can't pass undefined to an input value. React won't let us do that. It has to be a string value. So all we have to do is just check if the input value is undefined, which we can use this nullish coalescing operator. If the input value is undefined, then we just want to pass in an empty string. So it will either be a string with a value or an empty string. And then last, we'll just pass in the onChange event. And so we'll pass it the event and then handle change. So let's open up the site and see how we did. Let's write garlic. Okay, so let's see, we've got all of our recipes with garlic. So none of the desserts are showing up, which is great. And just like with our pagination, if you open up the Apollo DevTools, you can see that our search result is now appearing in our variable list. And it's the same thing if we delete it, then it will disappear because we set it to undefined. And you can see it dynamically being added as we add our query. So this is looking good, but we need to add a couple more features to get it working perfectly. The first is we want our results to be sorted by score rather than the entry date. So we get the most relevant results at the top. And the second is we want to make sure that we're resetting our pagination offset parameter every time we submit a search query to make sure that we're getting our results from the beginning of the list every time. So back in our homepage component, we're going to go back to our query variables object, and we're going to add our order by filter. And for this, we're going to use another React useRef because we don't want to resend the Apollo query if the order by changes. The order by is tied to the search filter. So this doesn't need to be stored in state. This can just be a reference variable. So we'll create a new variable and we'll call it query order by. And we'll use ref. And again, just like with search, we want the default value to be undefined so that it disappears if it is not in use. And we'll go ahead and pass that to our object, current value. And now down in our search handler, we want to update our query order by ref. And the way we're going to do that is first we're going to check if there is an input value. So if there is any kind of non-null value in the variable. If there is, so if there is a search query, then we want to filter by score. But if there is not a search query, then we want to undo that query order by variable and set it back to undefined. So if it's an empty string, the order by will be set to undefined, which means that Craft will revert to its default ordering of ordering by date. Otherwise, if there is an input value, if there is a search query, then we will order by score. And then the last thing to do is to set our offset value to 0. And that will make sure that our pagination always starts from the beginning with each new fresh search query. Okay, so now we've got our search results set up to display exactly the way we want them to. But one last thing we need to do is we need to figure out what to do if there are no results for a given search query. Because right now, if we type something into our search query that gives us no results, then we're just left with this blank space here. And that's not very useful for our user. We want to explicitly tell them that their query had no results. So we're going to go back into our recipe listing component. And you remember we've got this space where we are displaying other error messages. So we're just going to add a fresh one. So what we're going to check for if any entries were returned in the data set. So we will get a data array back, whether or not there are any entries in it or not, but it will just be an empty array. So all we have to do is just check for the length of our entries array. And if there is no length, i.e. there are no items in the array, then we'll just return a message. All right, and so now, if we type in some gibberish, we'll get a nice little message and the user will know why there are no results. Okay, we're all set up and this is working really well. And you can leave it just like this if you want to, but you've probably noticed that when we are typing in our search query, if I type garlic, for example, you'll notice Apollo is fetching for every letter in the word that I type. And so it's pinging the Craft site for every single letter, even though we haven't finished typing our full phrase. And that's really not great for performance. That puts an unnecessary burden on our Craft server. So if you want a little bit of extra credit, check out the article that I've linked in the blog post on how to add debouncing to your search query. And essentially, debouncing is just a little bit of JavaScript magic that waits for the user to finish typing a phrase before it submits the search query. And this article here on Mimo is a good explainer on how to do that. And you can do it either using a library like Lodash, or you can roll your own custom if you'd like to. And I really recommend you look into this because debouncing is, if you're doing any kind of search querying, it's a major help for improving performance on your website. But it's also a little bit beyond the scope of this tutorial series. And so now that we've got our search filtering set up, the last thing to do is to get our dietary restriction category filtering set up. And that's going to be our last tutorial, which comes up next.